Welcome to Terran Apex Protocol, where the galaxy keeps underestimating humanity and keeps regretting it. If these stories are your kind of story, subscribe and stay with us. My name's Atlas. Tonight, a fleet sets out to starve a human colony into surrender, and the humans answer the siege by opening a restaurant and feeding the very army sent to break them. Let's begin. On the 340th day of the siege, Mario Conquo coaxed one last harvest out of a dome that wanted to die and plated it like it was the easiest thing in the world. The dome was failing. She could read it the way she read everything in the colony, by the numbers that ran behind her eyes whether she wanted them or not, and the numbers said the algae vats were thinning, and the bean rows in Dome 4 had given what they were going to give, and the protein margin for the colony of Anvil Rock had slipped under the line 3 days ago and was not coming back up on its own. A year of blockade did that. A year of a Skell fleet sitting in orbit doing nothing, firing nothing, just waiting. The cleanest kind of war there was. The kind where you never had to look at what you were doing because hunger did all the looking for you. Mari finished the plate anyway. It was a nothing meal, reclaimed protein and dome greens, and a sauce she had built out of 3 things that should never have made a sauce. And she set it down in front of an old man in the commissary who had lost most of his appetite and most of his hope along with it, and she watched him taste it and come back into his face a little. Because that was the job. The job was not heroics. She had strong opinions about heroics. The job was that a person should taste something that reminded them they were a person, even on day 340, especially on day 340. And if you could do that with reclaimed protein and a failing dome, then you could do it with anything. And it was the only kind of fighting Mari had any patience left for. She had run out of patience for the other kind on day 6. On day 6, her brother Femi had gone out with the colony militia in the grand heroic sortie that Councillor Dunmore and the war faction had been so sure of, the bold strike to break the blockade before it tightened, the last stand that was supposed to make the Skell respect them. The Skell had not respected them. The Skell had not even particularly noticed them. The sortie had gone up into orbit and the siege fleet had swatted it the way you swat something in your sleep, barely waking, and Femi had not come back, and 19 other people's brothers and daughters had not come back, and the blockade had tightened anyway, exactly on schedule, because the High Bessiger had a doctrine, and the doctrine did not care about courage. After that, Mari had stopped going to the war meetings. She had a different war by then, a quieter one, fought with calories and sauces, and the stubborn refusal to let day 340 taste like surrender. Up in orbit, the war looked very different and smelled like nothing at all, which was the problem. Quartermaster Aspirant Tovo of the Skell Dominion counted his own fleet's rations on the 340th day and did not like the count. The siege fleet was hungry. No one said so out loud, because the doctrine of the bloodless siege was a proud thing, and you did not admit that the besiegers grew lean along with the besieged. But Tovo kept the numbers, and the numbers were thin. A year was a long time to hold a blockade at the end of a supply line that stretched halfway across the Dominion. His own throat sacks had gone the translucent gray that every Skell carried when the ration dropped. The hollow look that meant the body was eating itself a little. And he kept his collar high, so the junior crew would not see their quartermaster going gray, because a hungry army that knows it is hungry is a different and worse thing than an army that has merely been told to wait. High Besieger Vorentigrask told them to wait. The colonists will crack any day, his broadcasts said, in the calm voice of a man who had cracked 100 colonies and knew the sound they made. Hunger is the perfect weapon. It never misses. It spills no blood. It lets the conquered keep their honor by choosing, in the end, to yield. Hold the line and let the weapon work. Tovo had grown up hearing that the famine siege was the most humane way to win a war. And he believed it, the way you believe the thing that lets you sleep. And he kept his collar high and counted the rations and waited for the soft colonists to break. Tovo had seen the doctrine work, which was why he believed in it. His first deployment had been the siege of a world the Dominion called Sevet, a colony of some other species that had held out for 8 months and then yielded, exactly as the doctrine promised, with its cities whole and its people thin but alive. And Tovo had watched the surrender and thought it the most civilized thing he had ever seen, a whole world changing hands without a single dead, the conquered filing out to be counted while their towers still stood. No fire, no hillside. The famine siege had felt, that day, like the proof that his people had finally found a way to be strong without being monstrous. He had carried that proof into every siege since, and he carried it now, on day 340 over Anvil Rock, the certainty that hunger was the kind weapon, the patient weapon, the weapon you could be proud of, right up until a human colony took it away from him and showed him the other thing it had always also been. He did not know that down on Anvil Rock, the colony quartermaster had just made a decision the council was going to hate, because Mari Okonkwo had looked at her failing dome and her thinning numbers and the cleanest war in the galaxy, and she had decided she was going to point the kitchen the wrong way. The wrong way meant outward. Mari brought it to the council, and the council came apart over it the way she had known it would. She wanted the big dome, Dome 1, the show dome with the high glass and the good light. The one they had built for ceremonies back when Anvil Rock had ceremonies. She wanted to clear it out and put down long tables and turn it into a hall, and she wanted to broadcast an invitation on the Skell Fleet's own bands, open and unencrypted, in the trade tongue, and the invitation was this: any soldier of the besieging fleet who came down unarmed would be fed. No questions, no surrender asked of them. No propaganda, no terms, no trick. Come down hungry and leave full. That was the whole of it. Counselor Dunmore looked at her like she had lost her mind, and said so. You want to feed them, he said. You want to take food out of our children's mouths on day 340, with the domes failing, and carry it up to the men who are starving us, the men who killed Femi. Mari did not flinch at Femi's name, though Dunmore had used it like a knife, because she had made her peace with the knife a long time ago. You answered a war you hated with more of it, she said. The sortie. The last stand. You were so sure, and it cost me Femi, and it cost 19 other families, and it bought us nothing but a tighter blockade. I'm trying something else now. She slid the broadcast script across the table to him. Pass the salt, and let me try it. The vote was close, and it was ugly, and she won it by 2, because the colony was hungry enough to be desperate enough to let the quartermaster try a mad thing, and because some of them, quietly, were tired of a war that was being done to them, and wanted just once to do something back that did not taste like more dying. So Mari got her dome. She cleared Dome 1 and put down the long tables. Every table the colony had, end to end under the high glass, and the colonists started calling it the Long Table before she had even decided on a name, and on the 342nd day of the siege she opened the fleet's own bands and read her invitation into the dark. Then she lit the burners, and she cooked, and she waited to see if anyone in the whole starving sky was hungry enough to come down and find out whether the soft colonists meant it. For 2 days, nothing. The bands stayed silent. Dunmore made sure everyone saw him not gloating, which was its own kind of gloating. And then, on the 3rd night, a single Skell supply skiff broke from the fleet's pattern and came down dark and quiet to the edge of the colony, and a handful of gray-throated soldiers climbed out, weapons left behind as the invitation had asked, moving like people who had decided to be ashamed of this later, and they came into the high bright dome where the tables were set, and Mari Okonkwo fed the enemy for the first time. Tovo had come down with that first skiff, sent by his squad mates, as the one with the cleanest excuse, because a quartermaster could always claim he was assessing enemy supply, gathering intelligence on how much food the colony really had left. That was the cover, and it was even partly true. He told himself he was there to find the trick. Every soldier in the fleet knew there had to be a trick, because the alternative, that the colony you were starving would simply feed you, made no sense in any war anyone had ever fought. He sat down at the end of a long table, under the high glass, gray-throated and wary, and a human woman with steady hands set a bowl in front of him without a word, and he looked at it for a long time. It was a stew of some kind, dome greens and beans, and the reclaimed protein the colonists lived on, the same poor stuff they were feeding their own. He could see that they were not putting on a show with hoarded delicacies. They were feeding him exactly what they fed themselves, which was the first thing that did not fit the trick. He ate it because he was a year hungry, and the smell undid a year of discipline in about 4 seconds. And his throat sacs, which a skell cannot govern any more than a human, can govern a blush, flushed, warm and full and amber, right there in front of his own squad. The visible, unmistakable color of a body that has been fed, and there was no hiding it and no taking it back. He had eaten the enemy's food, and his own flesh had lit up with gratitude for it, where everyone could see. The shame of that was enormous, and it was also nothing next to how good it felt to not be hungry. And Tovo understood, sitting in the bright dome with his sacs glowing warm and traitorous, that the High Beziger's perfect weapon had a flaw no one had ever found, because no one had ever been mad enough to try this. You could starve an enemy who hoarded. You had no doctrine at all for an enemy who shared. He went back up to the fleet that night, with a full stomach for the first time in a year, and he did not report a trick, because there was no trick to report. He reported the soup. He told his squad, and his squad told theirs, and by morning 40 more skiffs wanted the coordinates. It spread the way hunger and rumor always spread through a tired army, fast and quiet and impossible to stop with an order. Night after night the skiffs came down, more of them, gray-throated skell, slipping the fleet's discipline to sit at the long table and leave with warm sacks and a thing in their chests they did not have a word for. And they went back up, changed, fed, quiet, and they talked, and the talk was worse for the siege than any sortie Femi's militia could ever have flown. Because a soldier who has been swatted from the sky hates you cleanly. A soldier who has been fed by you does not know what he feels, and an army that does not know what it feels is an army coming apart at a seam its admiral cannot see. But it cost. Mari had known it would cost, and she had told the council the truth about the cost, which was that you cannot feed 2 hungers from one failing dome without both of them going leaner. Every bowl that went to a skell soldier was a bowl that did not go to Anvil Rock, and the colony's own margin, already under the line, dropped further. Doc Asha Varga kept the ledger of it. The lean ration toll, the colonists whose recovery slowed and whose strength thinned, because the quartermaster was feeding the fleet that besieged them, and Varga brought Mari the numbers without comment, because Varga had decided to trust her, but the numbers were the numbers, and they climbed. Dunmore's faction had a name for Mari now. They called her the woman who starved Anvil Rock to coddle its killers. And they were not entirely wrong. And that was the thing about doing a hard, true thing, that the people calling you a traitor usually had a point you had to carry along with everything else. When Dunmore put the lean ration ledger in front of her and demanded to know how many of her own she would starve to feed the enemy, Mari did not look away from the number. As many as it takes to make one of them put down a gun he never fires, she said. That is the trade. I am not pretending it is free. Tovo kept coming back, which Mari noticed, the same young officer with the careful collar, coming down more often than the cover of intelligence could explain. And one night after the tables had cleared, she sat across from him with the burners cooling, and asked him the thing she had been carrying. "Why do you keep coming?" she said. "You could send anyone. You come yourself." Tovo was quiet for a long moment, and then he asked her the thing he had been carrying, which was the only question that mattered up in the cold fleet. "Why would you feed us?" he said. "We came to starve you. Your own people say you are taking food from your children to give to mine. Why would you do that for the fleet that killed your brother?" He had heard about Femi. The colonists talked too. Mari told him about Femi, the whole of it, the grand sortie and the swatting and the way the blockade had tightened anyway, and the things she had decided afterward, which she had never quite said out loud before, and found she could say to a gray-throated enemy more easily than to her own council. "I watched my brother answer a war he hated with more of it," she said, "and it killed him and changed nothing. So I decided I wasn't going to do that. I wasn't going to answer the thing I hate with more of itself." She gestured at the cold burners, the long, empty tables, the high dark glass. "Hunger's the one wound everybody in this whole sorry blockade has got in common, Tovo. Your fleet's got it. My colony's got it. It's the one thing we actually share, and I only know one cure for it, and it's not winning." She stood to bank the burners. "You're starving us to make us yield," she said. "I'm feeding you to remind you we're both just hungry. We'll see whose plan is stupider." Tovo had no doctrine for that. The Dominion had not issued one. He went back up to the fleet that night and lay awake in the gray with his warm sacks and could not find, anywhere in his training, the counter to a woman who fed you because she had decided that hunger was the enemy and not you. Up in the fleet, the thing Mari had started kept doing its quiet work, and Tovo had a front row seat to it because he kept the rations, and the rations told the truth before anyone else would. The mess decks changed first. A hungry army gripes constantly and loudly about the food and the officers in the war, and griping is healthy. Griping is the sound of an army that is still an army. The griping stopped. In its place came the quiet of men who had been somewhere they were not supposed to talk about, and who now had a thing to lose that was not their lives, but their picture of the war. You cannot keep a soldier angry at an enemy who has fed him. You can keep him obedient for a while, by discipline, by distance, by never letting him see the enemy's face. But Mari had put a face on it, and a bowl in his hands, and a warmth in his throat he could not hide from his bunkmates, and the distance the whole siege depended on was gone. Tovo watched crews that had held the line for a year start to calculate, very privately, what exactly they were still holding it for. He watched the count of skiffs going dark off the pattern, climb past the point where it could be called desertion by a few bad soldiers, and became, simply, the fleet, voting with its stomach, one night at a time. He stopped reporting the numbers accurately, and then he stopped reporting them at all. And he was not the only quartermaster in the fleet who had quietly gone blind to his own ledger. High Besieger Grask saw the rot before his subcommanders would admit it was rot. He had besieged 100 worlds, and he knew the rhythms of his own fleet, the way Mari knew the rhythms of a dome, and he could feel the discipline thinning, the skiffs going dark off the pattern at night, the gray throats coming back amber, the strange new quiet in the mess decks, where there had been the ordinary griping of a hungry army. His weapon was turning in his hand. The thing that had broken 100 colonies was being broken, not by a fleet, not by a sortie, but by a kitchen. He would not fire on the dome. This is the part of him the colonists did not understand at first, and the part that made him dangerous, and the part that in the end undid him. Tigrask had perfected the famine siege precisely because he could not stomach the other way. He had been a child on a world the old wars had firebombed, and he had watched a city burn for 3 nights from a hillside, the particular orange of a city that will not stop burning. And he had grown up and built a way of war where no city ever burned again, where you simply surrounded a world and waited and let the people choose to yield with their cities whole and their honor kept. He was proud of it. He had never in his life given an order that set a population on fire, and he was not going to start now over a soup kitchen. So he did not bombard the long table, though Sub-Besieger Call urged it. He reached instead for the only weapon his doctrine allowed against a rot in his own ranks, which was discipline, and discipline, it turned out, had a fire of its own. He ordered the blockade tightened, which only made his own fleet hungrier, and drove more skiffs down to the tables, because you cannot fix a hunger by deepening it. And then he ordered the fed conscripts recalled and made an example of, and that was the order that spilled the first blood of the cleanest siege in the galaxy, and the blood was his own people's. They took Sergeant Rel first, because Rel had been among the first down and had brought others, and Rel was Tovo's friend. They recalled the first squad of defectors under flag of fleet discipline, and they charged them with desertion in the face of the enemy, for the crime of having gone down unarmed to eat, and Sub-Besieger Call carried out the sentence and broadcast it to the whole fleet to stop the rot, the way you cauterize a wound. Tovo watched his friend die on the fleet channel for the crime of having been fed. He watched Rel's sacks go gray, and then go still, and he understood, in a way that a year of starving had never taught him, exactly what kind of weapon hunger had always been, that it had never been clean, that the cleanness was a story the well-fed told themselves, and that the moment it stopped working the bloodless siege would reach for blood like anything else, and reach for its own first. And down on Anvil Rock, the lean rationing took its own. Her name does not matter to the Dominion's histories, and it mattered enormously to Anvil Rock. She was one of the colony's elders, a woman who had come out on the first ships and turned a rock into a home. And she went down with a thing that the colony's thinned supplies and the slowed recoveries of the lean rationing could no longer fight, a small ordinary failure of the body that a well-fed colony would have turned back without a thought. And on day 371, she died of it. And everyone knew the rationing was part of why. And the rationing was part of why because Mari had been feeding the fleet. Dunmore did not have to say it. He brought the news to the long table himself and let the silence say it. "This is what your generosity costs," the silence said. "Here is the bill." Mari did not flinch from the bill, because flinching from it would have been a lie, and the one thing she would not do was lie about the cost. She had killed no one, and she had also not kept this woman alive, and both of those were true, and she made herself hold both of them. That night, she did a thing that the colony argued about for years afterward. She took the colony's book of names, the register of the Anvil Rock dead, and she wrote the elder's name in it. And then on the same page, in the same hand, she wrote Sergeant Rel's name, the Skell sergeant she had never met, who had died up in the cold for the crime of eating at her table. One page, the two of them, the starved and the fed. Because hunger had killed them both, the elder by its absence and Rel by the doctrine built around it, and Mari Okonkwo had decided that if she was going to carry the cost of this, she was going to carry the whole of it, and not just the half that let her sleep. That was the indictment of the whole war, she thought, that it had a book for its own dead, and no page at all, for the people on the other side of the wire who were dying of the same exact wound. The execution of Rel did not stop the rot. It accelerated it, the way cauterizing a wound with a torch will sometimes simply set the patient alight, because an army can forgive being sent to die in battle, but it cannot forgive watching its own be killed for the crime of having been fed. And the seam Tagras could not see tore wide open. Whole watches began refusing the recall. Tovo stopped keeping his collar high. And the high besieger understood at last that he was losing, that the cleanest weapon in the galaxy had been turned around and aimed back up his own supply line, and that he had exactly one move left that his doctrine had never imagined a besieger would have to make. He came down himself. He came down to Anvil Rock under no flag at all, with a small guard and sub-besieger call at his shoulder, urging him the whole way to simply shutter the dome and re-clean the war. And he walked into Dome 1 expecting to find decadence, expecting to find the trick at last, the hoarded luxury, the propaganda set, the thing that would let him understand the colony as an enemy again. He found the long table at the dinner hour. He found his own gray-throated soldiers sitting along the benches, with their sacks gone warm, and he found the colony's children eating from the same pots as the soldiers who had been sent to starve them. The human young and the skell crews ladled from the same thin stew, and he found Quartermaster Aspirant Tovo working the serving line, no longer in any collar that meant anything, handing bowls down the bench to colonists and conscripts alike. And on the wall, at the head of the dome, he found the colony's book of names open to a page where a human elder and a skell sergeant were written in the same hand. Mari Okonkwo saw the high besieger standing in the door of her dome with murder and confusion fighting in him, and she did not beg, and she did not gloat, and she did not call for guards. She picked up a bowl and she filled it, and she set it down at the empty end of the nearest table, across from where she stood, and she pulled out the bench. The whole dome had gone silent. The broadcast pickups the colony had set up for the nightly invitation were still live, which meant the fleet was watching, which meant the watching sector was watching, and Mari spoke to the high besieger across the length of the long table in the plain voice she used for everything that mattered. "You sent your fleet to starve us for a year," she said, "because you call hunger a clean weapon." She did not raise her voice. "So, we opened a restaurant, and we fed your fleet right back. You cannot keep starving the people who keep feeding you, besieger. It does not work. There is not a soldier up there in that cold sky who will fire on the one room where somebody finally fed him, and you know it, because you came down here yourself to find out why you were losing, and now you are standing in the answer." She nudged the bowl an inch toward the empty bench. "Sit down. You're hungry too. I can tell. Everybody up there is. Sit down and eat, and let's both stop pretending hunger was ever clean." Vorant Grask stood at the head of the long table, and he looked at his own conscripts being fed by the people he had come to break. And he looked at the warm throats and the shared pots and the human children beside the skell crews. And he looked last and longest at the wall, at the page where the human elder and Sergeant Rel were written in one hand on one side, and he felt the whole architecture of his life, the bloodless siege, the cities he had not burned, the proud, clean weapon he had built, so that no child would ever watch a city burn from a hillside the way he had, come down around him all at once. Because the woman was right. He had made hunger into a weapon so that he would never have to use fire, and she had taken his weapon and set it on a table and fed it to his own children. And there was no road left where he lifted a hand against Anvil Rock that did not end with him bombarding the dome, becoming the fire on the hillside, the thing he had run from his entire life. She had not beaten him with a fleet. She had walked him, one warm bowl at a time, to the edge of the only thing he could not do, and dared him to do it. He did not do it. He crossed the length of the long table, his guard frozen behind him, call hissing at his back, and he sat down on the bench across from Mario Conquo. And the dome held its breath, and the high besieger of the Skell Dominion picked up the bowl that the colony quartermaster had set for him. And he ate. And on the open channel that carried it, up to a hungry fleet, and out to a watching sector, he gave the order his doctrine had never once in his life required of him. "I made hunger into a weapon," Tigrask said, "so that I would never again smell a city burning." His voice was not steady, and he did not try to make it steady, because there was nothing left to perform. You took my weapon, and you set it on a table, and you fed it to my own children. And now I cannot lift a hand against you without becoming the fire I have run from my whole life. There is no clean way to starve a people who will not let go of the spoon. He set the bowl down. Lift the blockade, he said, to K-Hall, to the fleet, to the watching dark. Stand the siege down. All of it. Open the lanes. We are done starving Anvil Rock. He looked at the page on the wall, at Rel's name in a human hand. And bring my dead home, he said, more quietly. The ones I killed for eating. They were hungry. That was all they ever did wrong. The siege of Anvil Rock lifted on the 374th day, not because a fleet was beaten in the sky, but because a weapon died in the one place it could never win, which was a full table, and the sector called it the Long Table Armistice, though the colonists just called it the night the besieger sat down. The Skell Dominion retired the famine siege from its doctrine within the year, and not for the reasons the moralists wanted, but for a reason no admiral could argue with, which was that a hungry army cannot be trusted to stay an army. That hunger is a current that flows toward whoever holds the spoon, and that any weapon you cannot keep pointed at the enemy is not a weapon but a hazard. Supply and parley protocols replaced it. The strategists wrote long dry papers about the vulnerability of the besieging force to humanitarian counter-provisioning, and Mari Okonkwo, when someone showed her one of the papers years later, laughed until she had to sit down. The fleet that had spent a year starving Anvil Rock spent the next season helping it replant. The surviving conscripts came down in daylight now, no skiffs, no shame, and they dug and hauled and learned the domes, and they helped raise a new dome, where Dome 1 had been overworked to nothing, feeding two armies, and into the head wall of the long table, which they kept, which they would always keep, the colony carved three names. The elder who had died of the lean rationing, Sergeant Rel, killed by his own for eating, and Femi Okonkwo, who had died on day 6 answering a war he hated with more of it before his sister found the other way. One wall, both sides. The colony argued about it and kept it. Mari refused the council's medal, the belated one they tried to give her once it was safe to call her a hero instead of a traitor, and she refused Tigrask's formal thanks too when the Dominion sent it, because both of them tried to turn the thing into a monument, and the thing was not a monument, it was a kitchen. There's 400 new mouths to feed now, she said, between the colonists and the conscripts who had stayed, and the dome yields still down, and I'm rebuilding a sauce base from nothing. I've got prep. She went back to the burners. Tovo stayed. He was not a soldier anymore, and the Dominion, in the new way of things, let him go, and he stayed on at the long table as a cook's apprentice, his throat sacs warm and steady for the first time in his life, learning from Mari Okonkwo how to make her brother's recipe. Femi's recipe, the one she cooked on the days she missed him most. It was a strange thing, and they both knew it was strange. The Skell learning to cook the favorite dish of the human his fleet had helped to kill, from the dead man's sister, in the dome where a war had ended over a bowl. They did not pretend it was not strange. They just did the prep. Tovo spoke the only words anyone ever wrote down as the moral of the thing, and he said them once, to a sector journalist, who came years later asking how a restaurant had beaten a fleet, and he said them while chopping dome greens and did not look up. Our high Bessiger spent his whole life making hunger clean, Tovo said, so that no one would ever have to burn. He never once thought to ask the people he was starving, and they would have told him, the way Mari told me. There is no clean way to take a thing that everybody needs. There is only sharing it, or not. He scraped the greens into the pot. Then he asked the journalist if she was hungry, because she had been there a while, and it was nearly the dinner hour, and at the long table, you did not let a person sit at the table and not eat. Far off, on another blockaded human world that that had heard what happened at Anvil Rock. A colony council had just voted, and somewhere a quartermaster was lighting the burners, and an invitation was going out on the besiegers' own bands into the hungry dark.